Kia ora, and welcome to the Bridge Hub Water Challenge, a major Trans-Tasman initiative developed to identify research being undertaken by universities and other research institutions in both Australia and New Zealand to address some key challenges around water, its availability, its management and its quality. My name is Peter Hilton. I'm Executive Director of Agritech New Zealand and a member of the Australia-New Zealand Agritech Council. Before I introduce my two studio guests, I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenge. It was created by the Bridge Hub, which is a New South Wales innovation and investment hub focused on supporting early-stage Australian agritech companies. Its co-founder, Craig Shapiro, sits with me on the Australia-New Zealand Agritech Council, and in February at the Evoke Agritech Conference, which was held in February, I was joined by over 100 Kiwi professionals. There, the Bridge Hub announced that they were initiating the Water Challenge, and we discussed the potential for it to become more of a Trans-Tasman opportunity. And so today the challenge is being supported by a number of Australian-based research organisations, including CSIRO, AgriFutures Australia, the Universities of Melbourne, Canberra and Adelaide. In New Zealand, the challenge is being supported by Callaghan Innovation, by New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, the Agritech ITP and a number of our research organisations. Zespri have stepped up and are sponsoring a $25,000 prize for the research idea most likely to be commercialised. And the Bridge Hub have offered up to $100,000 of investment to the latest idea. The Water Challenge, therefore, has serious legs. However, before I introduce our first studio guest, Graham Bonnet, who's actually dialing in today from Brisbane, I would like to leave the next few words to the Honourable Michael McCormack, Australia's Deputy Prime Minister.
I congratulate the organisers and conveners of the Bridge Hub 2020 Water Challenge. It is looking to unlock some of the secrets, some of the research, some of the world's best advice, maybe from just an ordinary, everyday person with just an interest in water, because we know that water, the storage thereof, and the use thereof is one of the greatest challenges of modern times. Water is our most valuable resource and we need to use it preciously. Every single last drop needs to be maximised as far as irrigation, as far as agricultural growth, as far as the environment is concerned. Every drop of water is so precious, is so valuable. And that's why I congratulate the conveners of the Bridge Hub 2020 Water Challenge. They're employing the best minds from New Zealand and Israel as well. Of course, Australia-wide, we want to get those expert ideas, we want to get those notions, those concepts to tackle the Water Challenge. So well done, well done. I look forward to hearing all about the ideas, the solutions that come from this important challenge, that come from this important convention. Well done, and we look forward to really hearing all about it soon.
So there we are, great to hear from the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. I'd like to now introduce my two studio guests, one with me and one on the other side of the Tasman. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Graham Bonnet. Graham is calling in from Brisbane. He's currently the Research Director for the Integrated Agricultural Systems Programme in CSIRO, Agriculture and Food Division. CSIRO, for those that don't know, is a very large public sector research organisation in Australia. It's the largest of its type. And the goal of Graham's work is to identify ways of increasing agricultural productivity whilst respecting greater environmental constraints. It's great to have you with us today, Graham, on the programme. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce you to David Noon. David recently joined the University of Auckland and was appointed as and I have to read this, the Buckley Glavish Professor of Climate Physics at the University of Auckland in 2020. And it's great to have these two illustrious folk on on this panel this afternoon. Before I introduce, though, David in more detail, I'd like to have a few words, if possible, from New Zealand's Economic Development Minister, the Honourable Phil Twyford.
Water is one of our most precious resources, and like our cousins across the Tasman, just lately we've been reminded what an important issue it is. Whether it's the resource management considerations in Canterbury, the water quality issues in Havelock North, or the drought that we've been having recently in Auckland, we've had plenty of reminders about just what a challenge it is to manage our water resource properly. I want to thank everybody who's involved in Agritech on both sides of the ditch who are working on the Trans-Tasman Water Challenge. I'm really looking forward to seeing the innovative ideas that you come up with. It's great to see the collaboration between Australia and New Zealand on this most important issue. Good luck and kia kaha.
So there we have it. We have the words of two politicians, and now we're going to have the words of two experts. And so I'm going to first of all turn to Graham. Graham, I gave you a very brief introduction in terms of your current role within CSIRO. I think it'd be really interesting, though, to learn a little bit more about your background, and particularly that background in terms of how it might impact on the water challenge and some of the key challenges we're seeking to address, namely availability, management and quality.
So hi Peter, glad to do that. We've been working a lot in both dryland and irrigated agriculture, and in both of those situations getting the most out of water is key to increasing productivity and profitability. So we've undertaken several different approaches to that. In irrigated agriculture, we've been developing ways of monitoring water use and trying to use that to better predict and define how we use the water that's available. But what's driving us as we go forward is the fact that drought is likely to become more frequent and of longer durations in many parts of Australia. And so now we're looking at new ways of trying to address that, new ways of trying to help people grow the right things in the right places and get profitable outcomes as often as they can.
Okay, that's great, Graham. Thank you very much for that. David, same question to you. If you could perhaps provide just a little bit more background in terms of your own background as it relates to the challenge, and obviously some of the work you're currently doing with the University of Auckland.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. A lot of the work that we do is interested in the way that water moves through the environment and is part of the climate system, the relationship between weather and climate and the water that we have on the land surface, as well as in the clouds and precipitation patterns. What this means over the years is that we do a lot of modelling of the weather and climate systems, as well as water on the landscape, and making use of a variety of different types of innovative measurements, including from satellite and aircraft-based remote sensing. Within the academic framework, we develop a lot of theoretical understanding of the water and energy systems and try to think of ways to find applications within industry. That connection point is where we're seeking to find partnerships to continue that work.
That's interesting. I just want to carry on that concept you have of partnerships, because one of the aims of the challenge is to identify opportunities for more collaboration between researchers and research organisations. What's the kind of strategy, again, around your team and the University of Auckland in terms of trying to identify collaborative opportunities with other research organisations or researchers?
Yeah, partnerships are critically important in all aspects of science research and ultimately those applications. Within the university, there's a broad swath of water-based research that's going on, from water quality, understanding sprays, drop development, developing new materials for adhesion of water onto surfaces. That basic science has numerous immediate applications that can be developed. The partnership programs that we have involve a conduit to engage with specific partners, whether they be new, innovative spin-up companies, startup companies, or applications that build into existing large corporations, deep engagement that way. I would add that notion of partnership, I think, runs deep within the culture of academia, and one that we're seeking to grow further as well, thinking about the ways that water on the landscape is used by all sorts of groups and finding ways to use knowledge from different groups to improve our water systems.
And a very similar question, Graham, to yourself. In terms of CSIRO, I know Michael and Michael Robertson, who are Director and Deputy Director of the Agriculture and Food Division. How important is it for your organisation, again, to develop collaborative partnerships with research organisations, not only in Australia, but also potentially, say, here in New Zealand?
So, yeah, partnerships are very important. We do nearly all of our work with partners. We do very little on our own. We have several types of partners that we work with who help us provide the resources we need to do the work. But we also have deep and enduring partnerships with people like grower groups who actually implement a lot of the work on the ground. Other researchers that have complementary skills. And increasingly, we are working with startup companies, or in fact, generating startup companies from our own work to actually drive the outcomes into the marketplace.
That's interesting. We're talking here a lot about partnerships and relationships with researchers, but you've now introduced, obviously, the concept of startups. How important is the startup community and ecosystem to an organisation like CSIRO in terms of looking at the commercialisation of some of the research that you're currently conducting?
It's one of the pathways to get things out to be commercialised. So there are different models that we use, but the startup one, I guess, is something that is important when we want to move quickly. CSIRO is a big organisation, and so sometimes it's actually quicker to do things by creating a new company and allowing that to set sail. But we also work supporting other startup companies that aren't us, and that's also very useful, but it also means that we have to learn to think a bit differently and move quicker in the way that we do things when we are working with those partners.
That was, again, going to be a question. I'll pass the same message over to David, because very often my experience of research organisations is that when you secure a 5 or a 7 year grant from, say, from government on a very particular project, in my experience, it takes 5 or 7 years for that research to be complete until those grant dollars are spent. Where you're looking at commercialising research, potentially working with startups, you might need to become more agile. Now, I know at the university you've got Uni Services. Can you tell us a little bit about Uni Services and the role it plays and how it supports researchers around the commercialisation of the work that you do?
Yes, of course. Uni Services operates as effectively this conduit between industry, including development of startup companies, many of which are through innovations from our students. Students and the student work that gets done as project work, short-term project work, often has great ideas that can be commercialised. In some ways, one of the great benefits of the university environment is it allows this hotbed of ideas to be developed through student projects. Students are anxious to find careers, many of which they develop themselves as startup corporations. So in that sense, they're already on a very rapid turnaround time frame. You're absolutely right, though, that long-term research projects are long-term. And I would say, a 5-year research project may actually not be considered that long-term. Some of the projects we work with have been ongoing for arguably decades, and they continue. And while they're beneficial, that quick turnaround is important. One of the areas where Uni Services has been really helpful is to find those partnerships between industry, specific partners who want to engage in aspects of research and development of applications. That can be turned around very quickly, and seed grant or small projects that provide the proof of concept to the level that's beyond what can be done just at the university alone become really important for that.
So really interesting today, talking about water and the kind of critical importance it has in both countries. Here we are, Fieldays Online, Fieldays TV. So I really want to just ask a question now that relates water more directly to agriculture. As you were saying, Graham, before, in Australia you've experienced quite a significant drought really over the last few years, and that's likely to become the norm rather than an exception. How are farmers adapting to the shortage of water in terms of farming systems, the type of crops they're growing, the type of livestock methods they may be deploying to really combat that new reality of likelihood of extended droughts?
So one of the things that the data tells us is that over the last 10 or 15 years, there has been a series of adaptations made that mean we now are closer to reaching our yield potential for crops like wheat in dry years than we are in wet years. Obviously the yields are lower, but we're doing well managing the water that we do have available to us. Our challenge is now to come up with the next generation of farming systems that incorporate the next changes, how we incorporate some of the genetics that's coming through, like short coleoptile, that might allow us to sow deeper and sow in different ways, and getting the timing of sowing right, conserving moisture that falls during the summer period. But putting together into that system is really where we're going next in those kinds of systems. But also thinking about how else you can use the biomass that you can produce if you can't take crops through to grain, how you come up with the right decision support to help people work out when it's best to just cut that and use that for hay and feed. You mentioned about animal systems as well. Part of what we're interested in exploring now is do we have the mix right for the current and changing environments? Should we have more animals in the system, less animals in the system? How does that vary from place to place? So there's a range of ways we're tackling that, everything from Agritech to help individual decisions, but then how you put that all together in the system.
Thank you, Graham. Turning, David, to yourself and really now applying more of a kind of New Zealand lens to a very similar question. Clearly, at the moment, there's significant public interest and regulatory interest around water, particularly quality of water. And I know we were talking just before the studio began in terms of your own experience working with satellites and similar types of technologies. So what do you think the impact of water and climate change are going to be in terms of how it might apply to farming in terms of agricultural systems?
Now, Graham has made a great point earlier about this idea of optimality and also the underlying idea that water systems are becoming increasingly stressed, either because of environmental change, the way we're using the landscape, or changing weather patterns, and simply that our population increases are quite rapid here in New Zealand for sure, and we have to make use of that water for the population growth as well. In terms of that regulation of water quality, one of the questions comes is where should the decisions be made, and what's the right balance of where the decisions are made? Certainly there's a top-down approach where regulations can be put in place at a national or even international levels. One could take a different approach and use tools like remote sensing or aircraft-based measurements to allow farmers to make their own decisions. And an example there is making use of aircraft measurements for precision agriculture. It is far more effective and optimal in some ways to irrigate or fertilize in certain parts of a pasture rather than the whole lot. So if that decision is made at the farm scale or with communities of farmers, it's another way of putting in place not necessarily regulation, but finding optimal usage of the resources that are available.
I like the reference to satellites. I remember last year in New Zealand we had the 2019 Aerospace Challenge, and it was the first time that we talked about how satellites, which are very new to New Zealand in terms of Rocket Lab and our emergence as a space power, if that's the term I can use, combining that with our most traditional of industries, which is agriculture. And the role of the Aerospace Challenge was to try and identify how UAVs and drones and satellites could help detect issues around water and soil. So it was a really interesting bringing together of a very new industry with a very traditional industry. Just finishing off, Graham, if I may, in Australia. At the moment, clearly lack of water is a key issue. In terms of issues of management of the water that you have, are there any kind of interesting emerging technologies or thoughts around how to better manage water that is obviously extremely scarce?
Yeah, I think there's several approaches to this. Not all of the losses of water occur on farm, so better ways of moving irrigation water around where it needs to be moved to, reducing the evaporation from that. How we can stop evaporation once it's actually in the field. How we can basically apply the water better. It's a whole range of issues and trying to stack them all together so that we end up with more water available to do what we need to do with so we can grow more crops in more places. Something like every 4 megalitres of water that you could save from evaporation or other things will give you another hectare that you could irrigate, for example. So there's lots of different ways, and some of the more novel ways of thinking about this too are sort of in financial ways. What other ways are there of having financial markets for water that aren't just the normal markets, but options on those, and as the system matures, different ways of sharing risk as well, so that even when there isn't water available, that people can maintain their levels of income by risk sharing strategies.
Thank you, Graham. I think that's actually worth almost an entire session in its own right. So as we come to the end of this particular session, I'd just like to remind viewers that there is ample opportunity to take part in the Trans-Tasman Water Challenge. If you go to the Agritech New Zealand website, which is agritechnz.org.nz, it gives you all the details you need to know how to apply to become part of the challenge. There are specific categories for researchers, for startups, and we even have some moonshot ideas for university students who might just have a brainwave of an idea, and there's some prizes associated with each of these challenges. What we're also finally going to do is offer people who look like they have really promising opportunities the opportunity to field trial and test those technologies in both Australia and New Zealand. And we heard last week that colleagues in Israel are also keen to potentially engage, and so there will be an opportunity to work not only with our colleagues on both sides of the Tasman, but also with colleagues in Israel. So I'd like to thank both Graham and David for the time you've given us today. Really appreciate, Graham, the time calling in from Brisbane. David, obviously in Auckland, but thanks very much for your time, and to everybody who's watched this recording, thank you very much, and kia ora.